In the previous episodes of the Hard Surface Modeling video course update for Blender 2.80 and above, we went through the workbench basic settings. We talked about matcaps, solid shading, everything else you can find under the workbench render engine settings. And in the previous installment of this video course that was released some time ago, feels like eternity, we also talked about cycles in relationship to hard surface modeling and how cycles and path tracing rendering can help you in not so obvious ways to get better modeling experience. And now, unsurprisingly, it's time for us to take a look at Eevee, the new semi-real-time render engine of Blender 2.80 and above, and see how it can help us to achieve better modeling faster. Hell, it's about time. So welcome to the Eevee rendering tutorial smuggled into the modeling course. What's going on? So we have already went through the overlay settings and through the workbench engine settings that can be found in the viewport shading tab. And actually the solid shading mode in Blender 2.80, it's workbench. To switch over to Eevee, we have to go to the render engine settings and switch it from here. Obviously we have three render engines, Eevee, workbench and cycles. Cycles being the production ready high quality path tracing engine. Eevee, the new kid in the block. Eevee has three modes of rendering, which is solid shading mode, which is pretty much workbench, material preview, formerly look dev, and fully fledged rendering mode. And actually, let's first talk about the difference between the material preview mode and the rendered mode, because that's important. That may lead to some confusion. Let's remove the confusion. So when you are in the material preview mode, and you have any light sources in your scene, those light sources won't be taken into account because the material preview mode uses the HDRI environments by default, and you can change it from here and also change their parameters as well, like rotation, which is the Z rotation of the environment, strength, which is the brightness of the HDRI. If we take it way down to 0, we'll create some kind of a flat shading look that will make the eyes of this thing really pop, but it's getting a little bit scary, so let's back down. Okay, and the background slider basically allows us to reveal a little bit of the colors of the HDRI and allow us to blend between the world setting within the Blender scene and the approximation of the colors of the HDR maps. But actually, if we go ahead and enable scene lights and scene world checkboxes, we will tell the material preview mode to behave just like the rendered mode in Eevee. It will start taking the lighting information into account, and practically, it will make it look just like the rendered mode. No differences whatsoever. This is definitely the confusing part. Okay, aside from that, we have the newly added rendered paths drop-down menu where we can change the rendered paths from combined to, for example, normal to reveal the surface direction or the normals for whatever reason. Or, for example, we can go mist and that will render everything as the Z depth layer. And probably my vote for the favorite render path goes to Ambient Occlusion because it's great for just gazing at the pure geometry. In some sense, it's like getting to the essence of what you have modeled. It's the most minimalistic view on your model, simply. So that's the render passes of Eevee, which can be previewed in the material preview mode and in the rendered mode as well. But actually, let's go back and restore the settings, the combined pass, and so on. So basically, that's the material preview, formerly known as the look dev mode. Oh, and you can install even more HDRIs if you want to. But I think let's move on and explore the rendered mode. Now, this is a fully fledged, unclipped Eevee meant for high quality viewport rendering. And as you can tell, there is no more viewport settings. All the render settings can actually be found on the right-hand bar. Here we have lots and lots of options, and we will be talking about all of this practically in this tutorial. But allow me to mention quickly that the point of using Eevee over Workbench is to be able to use physically correct materials and materials in general. Just like in Cycles, in Eevee you have the access to all the cool shaders of Blender the principled BSDF, which is the physically correct Uber shader, having lots of different parameters like metallic, specular, roughness, and so on. And we also can customize the environment. And unlike the look dev mode, we can really go far with tweaking all the settings of the HDRIs and so on. So allow me to download some free HDRI from hdrihaven.com, the website by Greg Zal and the team that I cannot stop recommending in pretty much any video related to HDRIs. I'm downloading the Studio Small HDR image, which is not very high resolution, but we don't care at the moment. And now I'm pressing Shift A, going Texture, Environment Texture, clicking on Open, navigating to this Studio Small HDR. And now we can connect it to the color of the background shader, and we pretty much have set it up. The 360 degrees environment now illuminates our scene if we want to make it look a little bit more like the Workbench engine, so it doesn't distract us by displaying the actual background. We can add the mix shader, copy the background, and hook it up to the second socket of the mix shader. Now the magic. I'm gonna add the light path node and use the camera ray output as a mix factor between those two shaders. And look at this. And now the first background shader is used for illuminating the scene, and the second shader is used just for the camera, which is very nice. We can tweak the rotation of the environment by utilizing the mapping node. For example, we can rotate it on the Z-axis and watch how all the highlights and shadows change their position. Also notice a very nice interaction between a slightly reflective shader and the high luminosity values stored within the 32-bit HDR image. That is something that Eevee can give us right out of the box, and that is amazing. Once more, that is the setup that I used to separate the lighting from the background color. This is like the enhanced version of the Workbench engine. This is how we can use Eevee and still get the clarity of Workbench. Best of both worlds for extreme modeling experience. But for the time being, I'm gonna stick to the classical gray background. And let's move on and explore some more rendering options of Eevee. So once upon a time, seeing the light sources actually interact with the object in your viewport was considered to be an unthinkable luxury. But nowadays, we have it on by default. We just have to tick the shadow checkbox in order to see the approximation of the shadow. It has a bunch of parameters like clip start that controls the threshold below which objects stop generating shadows, and bias that I rarely touch. And what's important to know about the shadows in Eevee is that although the light source controls the light gradients, the shadow softness is decoupled from the light source. And actually, to restore that link, we need to go down to the shadows panel in the render settings and tick the soft shadows. And personally, I think that the soft shadow approximation in Eevee works really well. I would go as far as saying that it looks reasonably close to the path traced shadows in Cycles. It's so good. It's definitely a step in a very exciting direction of real-time rendering and game engines. And actually, soft shadows are super valuable for sculpting and for modeling because, no pun intended, soft shadows model the surface in a really good way, unlike the sharp shadows that tend to break up the surface. So it's great to be able to obtain a really soft light source within the 3D viewport of Blender. And to get back a little bit of the high frequency shadow sharpness, we can go ahead and enable the contact shadows checkbox. You know what? Let's take a look at the comparison. Here's the contact shadows turned off, and look at this. Now all the bells and whistles and the crevices of this robotic head got emphasized, and I love it. I couldn't help but notice one minor con of the soft shadows. Basically, it flickers a lot when you update the viewport. I guess that's the trade-off for having a really believable soft shadows right in your viewport. And yet another option that may help us to get better understanding of our 3D model is Ambient Occlusion. Ambient Occlusion simulates self-shadowing occurring where the surfaces meet each other. And here I took the factor to some ridiculous number just to showcase the effect, but usually it's good enough if we set it to, say, 2, and especially when used in conjunction with the contact shadows, it can give us much better representation of our actual geometry, say, of where the details are located, how deep are the crevices, what are the distances between the objects, and generally it just helps to read the mesh. And once again, starting from Blender 2.82, we can preview the Ambient Occlusion render pass from this menu, maybe to tweak it a little bit better. We can control the distance or the fall-off of the effect, as well as the trace precision, stuff like that. And just like the cavity mode within the Workbench engine, I find Ambient Occlusion to be very informative. And although the difference may not seem striking, it is actually quite radical. It is the difference between overdoing details, pushing the parts of the geometry too far away and so on, just to make it visible in the viewport, and doing it properly. Alright, we won't be going over all the options of Eevee, like bloom and depth of field, although I think we can mention it really briefly. So if you have a really bright material somewhere in your scene, after enabling bloom effect, it will start to glow, as simple as it sounds. Theoretically, it could be useful for dragging the viewer's eye to a certain portion of the mesh, so you can judge where to put most of the effort in terms of modeling. If the viewer's eye will reside in this part of the mesh most of the time, maybe it's worth adding some extra details there. So hooray, we managed to tie it with the modeling somehow. Achievement unlocked. And I won't be lying, I don't know how to mention depth of field in the context of 3D modeling properly. Personally, I pretty much never ever use depth of field when modeling, but anyway, here's how it works. First, we go into the camera settings and click on the depth of field checkbox over there to see a beautiful bokeh, and we can control it by picking the focus object or by controlling the focus distance for that matter. And the slider that controls the width of the depth of field effect is the f-stop parameter. Just like in your camera, the lower values produce more shallow depth of field, and as you go higher and higher, the depth of field becomes wider and wider. There are a lot of personalities and modeling styles, maybe some of them could incorporate depth of field into their workflow, who knows? Alright, and the next thing we can take a look at is screen space reflections. And not only reflections, but also refractions. And that reminds me of a good old reflect-refract shader in 3ds Max, where these two functions were combined in one. Really brings back good memories. So when we have highly specular or highly reflective material, we can really benefit from using the screen space reflection option in Eevee, because that would give us much more realistic reflections, especially in the cases where there are lots of reflective objects that should reflect each other. So in order to activate screen space reflections, let's jump into the render options menu and tick screen space reflections. Basically, I would describe it like this. It works kind of like ambient occlusion for reflective surfaces, if that makes sense. It kind of helps to emphasize the places where two surfaces meet each other. It helps to emphasize crevices and connections and high-frequency details as well. So that's simply a much more realistic-looking reflection. But most importantly, it helps to understand the relationship between the models, how close they are to each other. It generally helps to understand the space within 3D viewport, and that's why we should use it. Probably not for making everything realistic, because for modeling it doesn't matter that much. Okay, the options like half resolution trace are meant for additional optimization of screen space reflections, because they can be a little bit heavy, you know, especially when you have a lot of objects in the scene and you have all the other checkboxes enabled, like ambient occlusion, contact shadows. It may account for a slight performance drop, definitely. So here we go. Feel free to experiment with all the other options like max roughness and other stuff. And we will actually explore the next thing on our list, which is screen space refraction. That one is very interesting, and it's a little bit weird to see transparent objects in 3D viewport, as for me, because traditionally the viewport was reserved for the solid objects, and the transparent objects were simply banned from 3D viewports of any 3D content creation suite you can imagine, due to the separation between modeling and rendering tasks. Alright, I'm gonna create the glass shader, and I will assign it to a bunch of objects, then jump into the material editor, delete the principal BSDF, press Shift A, go shader, and let's add the glass shader instead, and connect it to the surface input of the material output. Alright, in order to see the transparent objects right in our viewport, we still need to do a little bit of a setup. It's a little bit complicated. First off, I will change the blend mode of the material from opaque to alpha blend, and then we will have to enable screen space refraction checkbox. Next, the shadow mode needs to be set to alpha hashed or alpha clip, I believe. And finally, in the render settings tab, we need to activate refraction. And after going through all the hassle, we will see that the glass material became transparent in the viewport, but we cannot see through. And that because we have this shell put inside the mesh to prevent the light leaking artifacts. But for the time being, let's just hide it. I can easily imagine a few cases where being able to see transparency right in your 3D viewport can be very beneficial for modeling, because not all objects are opaque, and come on, some of the objects are even volumetric. Thankfully, we have the volumetric rendering capabilities in Eevee. But anyway, screen space reflections and refractions are great to have as an option, because that means that what we see is what we get. We can model straight in the 3D viewport with transparency turned on. For some workflows, it may prove beneficial. And anyway, at any time we can go back to the solid shading mode, which is essentially the workbench render engine, as we have already mentioned. Or we can toggle back and forth between the solid shading mode and the rendered mode to reveal different aspects of our model during different stages of the workflow, if that makes sense. And it looks cool though. What else do we have on our list? Volumetrics. Probably we won't have to go there. Well, maybe not now, not for the time being, but volumetrics are still there. And you can find it under the render settings. And shadows, we have already talked about it. What we also can talk about is indirect lighting. In Blender 2.80 and above, we have something that is called irradiance volume, and just for the sake of thoroughness, I will quickly show how it works. So we create the indirect volume, make sure that it encompasses the entire scene, and click Bake Indirect Lighting. And after Blender calculates the light bounces and so on, and bakes it into the irradiance map, we see the additional brightening of the areas that were initially in the shadow, but now due to the additional light bounces, that they received a little bit of illumination. But once again, that is pretty cool for visualization and for VFX and for anything else you can imagine, but not as much for modeling. What else? We can set the viewport background to transparent, and if we now render the OpenGL image from viewport, we will have transparency. We will be able to save it as PNG. We also have Freestyle, which is non-photorealistic line render engine for Blender, and it works with Eevee just fine. If we activate Freestyle and render it out and wait for a few seconds, we will see that now the render looks like it's a technical drawing, or it became a little bit more stylized, you can put it like this. It could be very useful for presenting your 3D models as technical drawings or as concept art. And lastly, we have the color management settings, where we can choose the view transform. By default, it's set to filmic, I think. That is the option that allows you to retain the most of the dynamic range treats the highlights just like film. It applies a smoother fall-off to highlights, and this is not as important for 3D modeling as for visualization, but anyway, it is good to know. And let me try to set up some example to showcase it a little bit better. So I set the power of the slide source to a much higher volume, and now if you go ahead and change the view transform to standard, you will notice how some parts of the mesh get washed out. That may or may not be a big of a deal for you, but to retain the luminosity range displayed on your monitor, you preferably would like to switch over to Filmic instead and use the medium contrast or something like that to get a little bit of contrast back. It looks, I would say, more neutral in terms of slightly desaturated highlights. That is great for 3D modeling because nothing distracts you from seeing the vertices and polygons and so on. And funny thing, it also works in the Workbench render engine. Let me quickly set up some example. So let's get over to the render engine settings, change the render engine to Workbench, click this icon at the top over here, which is rendered mode, and only in this weird rendered mode of the Workbench engine, the color management settings will actually work. Okay, and now for no particular reason, I also enabled the flat shading, which we have discussed in one of the previous tutorials. And I did that so the next thing that I'm going to demonstrate looks beautiful, and that is the viewport rendering. That is something that changed in between Blender versions. In Blender 2.79, it was located under the render settings at the top of the screen, but no more. Now it can be found under the View tab. So we have to go View, Viewport, Render Image. And that will render out what you see in the viewport, including the settings like flat shading and also color management. Ta-da! I think it looks great already. And one more thing that I would do to take it to the next level of awesomeness is crank up the resolution. Let's put it up to 200% for better anti-aliasing, and I'm gonna render it out once again. But where am I? Oh yeah, we have to switch to the 3D viewport and then go View, Viewport, Render Image again. So that's how to render the image straight from your viewport in Blender 2.80 and above. Awesome, and just for the sake of complete insane thoroughness, I'm gonna mention Cycles. Cycles is a good old path tracing engine of Blender, capable of producing photorealistic results due to the path tracing algorithm that is used for rendering. So if you're into this kind of scrutiny of previewing your models in completely photorealistic setting, you can use Cycles to do that. Actually, I salute this approach and I deeply appreciate it because I'm that type of person who likes to search for tiny flaws in the mesh using Cycles. Oh, maybe some kind of a bug will manifest itself or not, but anyway. And then we can hunt it down and kill it easily. Eevee uses lighting approximations all around the place, and Cycles is that kind of precise, ruthless machine that will simply bounce the photons off your mesh and show all the artifacts your mesh happens to have. That's why it's useful to put your model under the Cycles scrutiny once in a while. It definitely helps. For more Cycles in the context of 3D modeling, feel free to watch one of the bonus tutorials from the original hard surface modeling course. It's still relevant no matter how much time has passed. Maybe it's eternal. Oh, actually, and before I forget, one thing that is absolutely impossible in both Eevee and Workbench is a perspective camera. I mean a panoramic camera, for example, fisheye camera if you wish, or it can be an equidistant camera which shows a full 360 degrees view. So you may definitely invent a new extreme style of 3D modeling where this type of camera may actually be useful. Right, one more note before we call it a day. Although these render options of Eevee and Workbench, like shadows, contact shadows, ambient occlusion and so on, are super appealing, they also have a certain performance cost attached to them. Depending on the complexity of your scene and on your hardware, there can be a breakpoint where the modeling process will no longer feel smooth and fluent. Just like in video games, the performance drop is real when you crank up all the render settings. This is pretty much unavoidable, and ironically in the Workbench render engine it's even worse than in Eevee if you turn on the shadows, the cavity, and in the cavity settings you choose both to make it world space and screen space at the same time, and also you want to play with the specular lighting to make sure it looks absolute best. And bam, here comes the dreadful breakpoint in performance, where performance drops down a little bit, but it's enough to make you feel uncomfortable with the responsiveness of the viewport. Sometimes it's hard to put it in numbers and to even describe it, but it feels like the viewport is laggy. And as I've mentioned, Workbench could be really worse than Eevee in that sense, even if it's counterintuitive. So that's just something to keep in mind. My name is Gleb Alexandrov, and you're watching the Hard Surface Modeling video course for Blender 2.80 and above by me and ID Burrows. Drink more coffee and we will change the world of computer graphics.